It was early Saturday morning, and I was running on fumes. The kind of tired that isn't just physical but mental, too. I'd spent the last few days in a fog of anxiety and uncertainty, trying to keep my life from falling apart, but now, as the sun barely peeped over the horizon, I could feel the weight of everything pressing in on me. The wedding was supposed to be today. Supposed to be. But at this point, the idea of it was laughable. The decision to call it off had come in a whirlwind of confusion and heartbreak, and now I was left standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure of how to move forward. I tried to ignore the feeling that seemed to swallow me whole, tried to push it down as I began my morning routine. I made coffee, black, just the way I liked it, and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, feeling the weight of the silence around me. Sarah wasn't home yet. I knew she'd been awake late into the night, probably trying to sort through her own feelings or maybe just avoiding facing the truth. The truth? What was the truth, anyway? I looked at the clock. It was nearly 6 a.m., and I hadn't slept much the night before. Sleep had become a distant luxury over the past few weeks, as everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. The cancellation of the wedding wasn't just a cancellation of an event. It felt like the dissolution of everything I had built with Sarah, all of the promises we'd made to each other. 6 years of planning, building, and imagining a future together were slipping through my fingers like sand. The decision to cancel the wedding wasn't just about Evelyn's actions, though that was the immediate trigger.
No, this went deeper than that.
There had always been cracks in our relationship, small things I ignored over time. I had convinced myself that everything would work out, that we would work it out, but now it was clear to me that we were both playing roles that no longer fit, and in the end, we weren't even sure who we were anymore. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my head, and took another sip of coffee. The bitterness didn't help, but the warmth was comforting. I set my cup down and scrolled through my phone, glancing at the messages that had accumulated overnight. I had called off the wedding yesterday. There had been some back and forth between me and Sarah, some shouting, some tears, but mostly silence. It felt like everything was hanging in the air unresolved, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't even know if it could be fixed. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. It was Carl, my brother. I hadn't spoken to him since the fiasco the day before. He had come to visit me, not knowing what was happening between Sarah and me. In hindsight, I wished I had kept my distance, but at the time, it felt like a distraction, a break from the madness. I didn't know it then, but that visit was going to bring everything to a head. I hit the green button to answer the call, and Carl's voice came through, heavy with tension. "Hey, man. Got a minute?" "Yeah, sure," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. I had so much to deal with, and the last thing I wanted was another difficult conversation with my brother. But I knew I couldn't put it off. "Listen, I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, but we need to talk about what happened." I exhaled sharply, running my hand through my hair. My heart was already racing, a mix of dread and frustration welling up inside me. "I know, Carl. I'm still processing everything. To be honest," I said, my voice softer now. I need some time to figure this out." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear him weighing his words. "Yeah, I get it. But I think I need to explain myself. The whole situation with Sarah, hell, everything that's going on, I just need to get it out." I glanced at the clock again. It was still early, and I wasn't sure how much of a conversation I was ready for. But Carl's voice had that serious tone, the one that said this wasn't just another chat. This was something big. "All right, go ahead. I'm listening." Carl took a deep breath. "Look, I didn't mean for things to get so complicated. I never thought Sarah would get the wrong idea. But I need to come clean about something. That whole thing with the sexting, using your computer to chat with someone, I didn't think it would cause this much damage. I wasn't thinking straight. I froze. That hit me harder than I expected. My brother, Carl, the guy I had always looked up to, the one who had helped raise me in some ways, had used my computer for something like that. The realization stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. But I had to keep my composure. Sarah was already crushed by the truth, and now I had to figure out how to handle this. "You're telling me you've been doing that on my computer?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. There was a long silence on Carl's end before he spoke again, sounding sheepish. "Yeah, man. I'm sorry. I know it's messed up, but it's complicated." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of the situation settle around me. "You didn't tell Sarah, did you?" Carl hesitated. "No. She doesn't know. I didn't want to tell her. I didn't want to hurt her or make things worse between you two." I closed my eyes, trying to process everything he was saying. The betrayal, the lies, the secrecy, it was a lot to take in. But there was more I needed to know. "Okay," I said slowly. "But you've got to tell her, Carl. I can't keep taking the hit for this. I can't carry this for you." Carl sighed deeply, his voice tinged with frustration. I know, and I will. I just need to figure out how to tell her. Things between me and Karen, our marriage, it's been on the rocks for a while, you know? After the kids came along, everything changed, and I guess I started looking for something outside of that. I didn't think it would get this far. His words were a gut punch. Carl had always been the stable one, the older brother who had it together. But now, here he was, admitting to things I couldn't have imagined. I didn't know things had gotten that bad for you, I said quietly, feeling a wave of sympathy for him. But you have to deal with this. You need to tell Karen the truth. She deserves that. Carl paused again, and I could almost hear him weighing his options. Yeah, you're right. I just don't want to destroy everything. I've been trying to fix things with Karen. We've been going to counseling for the last few months. It's been helping, I think. But the thing is, it's been rough for a while, man. The kids, the pressure, the intimacy issues, it all piled up. And I got caught up in a stupid escape. I'm not proud of it. I ran my hand over my face. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about Carl's entire life unraveling in front of me. I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know if anything could be fixed. You need to be honest with Karen, Carl. I'm not asking you to tell Sarah. She'll figure it out eventually, but you can't hide from the truth forever. I know, Carl muttered. I'll tell her. Just give me some time. We ended the conversation with a promise from Carl that he'd come clean to his wife. But I wasn't sure how to feel. My mind was spinning with all the implications, and I still had so much to process. What would Sarah think when she found out it was Carl, not me, behind the messages? Would it make a difference? More importantly, how was I going to fix the mess I was in? The reality of the situation was starting to set in. Calling off the wedding was only the beginning. The fallout was going to be huge. And no matter what happened next, I wasn't sure I could put everything back together. The morning after the phone call with Carl, I was still reeling. The conversation had left me feeling both exhausted and conflicted. I hadn't expected to hear the things Carl said, his marriage, his struggles, the way he had let everything spiral out of control. It was hard to reconcile the image I had of him as the grown-up brother with the reality of his mistakes. And then there was Sarah, her silence, her tear-streaked face from last night. Everything had become so tangled, and I wasn't sure if I could keep untangling it. When I woke up, the house felt eerily quiet. It was the kind of silence that echoed. Sarah wasn't in bed next to me. I couldn't help but notice the absence of her warmth. The tension in the air was so thick that I could almost feel it pressing against my chest. I dragged myself out of bed, rubbing my eyes as I walked into the kitchen, the coffee from earlier still cold in my mug. I poured a fresh cup and sat down at the kitchen table, trying to find some semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos. I knew today was going to be hard. Hell, the entire week had been hard. After I had called off the wedding yesterday, there had been a strange calm, but it was the kind of calm that felt like the eye of a storm. The real turbulence hadn't even started yet. I glanced over at my phone again, half expecting another message from Sarah, some new revelation, or a response to the letter she had left me. But nothing. Just the usual notifications. I didn't know if I was relieved or disappointed. I had wanted to talk to her, to confront her about the things she had said, the things she had done, but I wasn't sure how to start that conversation. Every time I thought about it, the words caught in my throat. Sarah had gone to the courthouse the night before to bail out her sister, Evelyn. That decision alone felt like a betrayal. I understood the impulse to help family, but it wasn't just Evelyn who had caused all of this mess. Sarah had her own role to play, and yet, she seemed to be avoiding the conversation we so desperately needed to have. I had hoped that after the confrontation last night, we might finally sit down and talk it out, but it seemed like she was doing everything she could to avoid it. Instead of facing our issues head-on, Sarah had retreated into this passive-aggressive silence, which only made things worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being manipulated, both by her and by Evelyn, whose presence in our lives was now impossible to ignore. I needed to make a decision, but I was stuck. I was torn between my loyalty to Sarah and the realization that maybe we had both been too comfortable in this toxic cycle. She had been avoiding conflict for as long as I knew her, never standing up for herself, never voicing her true opinions or desires. She'd always been the perfect girlfriend, the one who put up with everything, kept the peace, and silently sacrificed herself to make me happy. But now, I couldn't help but feel like that perfect image was a mask, one that hid her insecurities, her fears, and her inability to make a decision for herself. The letter she left me last night was the only real communication we'd had in days, and even it felt passive, as though she were speaking through the letter instead of facing me directly. I had read part of it, the first few pages, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't a love letter asking me to reconsider. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a confession of her own inner turmoil, and I wasn't sure how to process it. I stood up from the table and went to the living room, where the letter sat on the coffee table, the edges of the pages slightly crumpled from being shoved under the door. It wasn't a short letter either. 20 pages, handwritten in that hasty, frantic style of someone who had stayed up all night to pour their heart out. I couldn't help but feel a bit of resentment as I picked it up. How could she have written all this without ever once speaking to me? But then again, I realized I wasn't being fair. Sarah had never been good at speaking her mind, especially when it came to her feelings. She had always hidden behind words, behind gestures, behind this carefully constructed persona of the good girl. Maybe she thought this was the only way to communicate, to write it down, to avoid confrontation. But I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. I took a deep breath and opened the letter, starting where I had left off the night before. As I read, I felt a strange mix of emotions: frustration, sympathy, anger, and disbelief. The letter wasn't just about the wedding, or Evelyn, or even the mess between us. It was about Sarah's childhood, her fears, and the way she had lived her life. She wrote about growing up with Evelyn, about the constant bullying and emotional manipulation she had endured from her older sister. But it wasn't just Evelyn. Sarah's entire life had been spent trying to appease others, trying to be what everyone needed her to be, whether that was a daughter, a girlfriend, or a future wife. She wrote that she had always been terrified of conflict, of upsetting people, of making them angry. She had learned early on that if she kept quiet, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was fine, people would love her. And that's how she had lived her life, silently carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations and desires while suppressing her own needs, her own voice. As I read, I started to see the patterns in our relationship, the way Sarah had always been the perfect girlfriend, the way she had always said yes to everything I wanted, always agreed with whatever I decided. I had never once had to argue with her. I had never had to fight for her opinion because, quite honestly, she never gave one. And now I was realizing that wasn't healthy. It wasn't love, it was control. And that realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I stopped reading for a moment, feeling the weight of what she had written settle in. I had never known the real Sarah. The person I thought I knew was just a reflection of what she thought I wanted to see. She had never shown me who she truly was, the person behind the perfect facade. And now, after all these years, I was starting to question everything. I continued reading, and it became clear. Sarah wasn't just afraid of disappointing me. She was afraid of disappointing everyone, her parents, her sister, me. She had built this entire version of herself around the idea of pleasing others, and it had completely consumed her. And the worst part was that I had been blind to it. I had let her slip into this role, without ever questioning it, without ever truly seeing her. I thought back to the night before, when we had fought, when I had told her the wedding was off. I had been angry, frustrated, hurt, but I hadn't really understood what was going on beneath the surface. It wasn't just the mess with Evelyn, or even Carl's confession. It was Sarah's entire inability to stand up for herself. She had been hiding in the shadows of everyone else's expectations for so long that she had lost herself. And now, it felt like she was suffocating beneath it all. I sighed, running my fingers through my hair. This was so much bigger than I had realized. It wasn't just about the wedding or Evelyn's betrayal. This was about Sarah's entire life, and now, it felt like everything was unraveling. I wasn't sure how much of it I could fix. I wasn't sure if I even could. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Sarah needed help. Real help. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly pleasing others, suppressing her own feelings. And maybe, just maybe, I had played a part in that. By allowing her to continue down this path, by never questioning her, by never challenging her, I had become complicit in her silence. I sat down on the couch and leaned my head back, staring at the ceiling. I felt like I had just uncovered a whole new layer of the woman I was supposed to marry. But now, I wasn't sure who that woman was anymore. I wasn't sure if I could even love her the way she needed to be loved. I heard Sarah move around upstairs, and I knew the moment was coming. The moment when we would have to confront all of this, to finally speak the words we had been avoiding. But I wasn't ready.
Not yet.
When she came downstairs a few minutes later, her eyes were red and swollen, like she hadn't slept much. I could see the uncertainty in her gaze, the way she was trying to gauge my mood. She knew something was off, but she didn't know what. I could feel the tension thickening in the air between us, like two people stuck in a conversation that neither of us knew how to start. She sat down beside me, her fingers nervously twisting a loose thread on her sweater. "We need to talk," she said softly, breaking the silence. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. The words were there, but I didn't know how to say them. I didn't know how to tell her everything I had learned, everything I had realized. And I didn't know if we could survive it. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We do. But as I looked at her, I couldn't help but wonder. Could we really fix this? Or had we both been too broken for too long? The day after the fallout with Sarah was one of those gray, monotonous mornings that felt like the physical manifestation of my emotions. It was as if the universe itself had decided to mirror the bleakness I felt inside. The house was cold, quiet, and uninviting, and I couldn't escape the weight that had settled over everything. I had spent the entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, playing the events of the past few days over and over in my mind. The letter, the confrontation, my conversation with Carl. Each one felt like a layer in a thick, impenetrable fog that clouded my thoughts. I was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, and physically. The thing was, I had no idea what came next. The wedding had been called off, yes, but that didn't solve anything. It didn't fix the crumbling relationship between Sarah and me, and it certainly didn't address the mess that was now my family, with Carl's involvement in my downfall and Sarah's betrayal, her silence, her avoidance. I knew something had to change, but I couldn't figure out what. How do you repair a relationship that had never really been whole to begin with? I had told Sarah that we needed to talk, but when that moment came, it felt like we were two strangers walking through a minefield of unspoken words. She had tried to approach me that morning, her face pale and drawn, like she hadn't slept, which I knew she hadn't. Her eyes were puffy from the crying, and I felt a pang of guilt. I had put her through so much, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was long overdue. She had to face her own demons, just like I was facing mine. "Are you okay?" she had asked, her voice tentative, almost fragile. I could barely look at her. The words I wanted to say were lodged in my throat. How could I explain to her what I had just begun to understand about our relationship? How could I articulate the way she had never really been there with me? Not in the way I needed. She had always been this perfect, compliant version of a partner, but that wasn't real. That wasn't healthy. I wanted to tell her that, but instead, I just nodded. "I'm fine," I lied, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I wasn't ready to dive into everything just yet. I needed to process this. We needed to process this, but I wasn't sure how. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "We need to talk about what happened, don't we?" she asked, her voice small, almost pleading. I met her eyes for the first time that morning, and there was an ocean of uncertainty there, uncertainty that mirrored my own. I nodded again.
Yeah.
"We do? But where to start?" I had no roadmap for this conversation. There was so much that needed to be said, so many truths to be faced. The weight of the past few days hung over us like a storm cloud, and I had no idea how to start clearing it away. It felt like everything we had built together was now a house of cards on the verge of collapse. "We don't have to do this right now," she said softly, almost as though she were afraid I might break. "We can take our time." I shook my head.
No.
"We can't keep avoiding this, Sarah. We've been avoiding it for years. I've been avoiding it. But we can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." Her eyes flickered with a hint of panic, and for a moment, I thought she might cry again. But she didn't. She just nodded, her lips trembling slightly. We both knew this wasn't just about the wedding being called off, or the drama with Evelyn. It was about the years of unspoken truths between us, the quiet dissatisfaction, the unacknowledged pain, the fact that I had never truly known her, and vice versa. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, her posture stiff, like she was preparing for an interrogation. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. The silence between us felt thick, almost suffocating. Finally, I spoke, my voice low. "I don't think I've ever really known you, Sarah. Not the way I should. And I don't know if you've ever really known me, either." Her eyes widened, and she looked like I'd just slapped her. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, the vulnerability in her voice impossible to ignore. "I mean," I said, trying to find the words, "that we've been living in this. I don't know, this fantasy. This perfect relationship where nothing ever went wrong. You always agreed with me, never argued, never even gave your own opinion. I didn't even know what you really wanted out of life, out of us. And you never let me see the real you. I don't know who you are underneath all of that." There it was, the crux of it. The thing I'd been avoiding saying. Sarah had always been so accommodating, so perfect. But I had realized over the last few days that it wasn't really her. It was a version of her that had been crafted out of fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of conflict, fear of being abandoned. She had never shown me her true self because she didn't even know who she was. She had built a life around pleasing everyone but herself, and I had let it happen. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away. "I didn't mean to be that way," she whispered. I just didn't know how to be any other way. I didn't want to lose you." I felt a surge of sympathy for her, mixed with a deep sense of frustration. I wanted to reach out, comfort her, tell her everything would be okay. But I also knew that we couldn't keep living in this cycle. We couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. "I know you didn't want to lose me," I said softly, my voice betraying the heaviness in my chest. "But you've been losing yourself, Sarah. You've been losing us." She opened her mouth to say something, but she stopped herself. For the first time, she seemed to be considering the weight of my words. She wasn't just trying to defend herself or explain away her actions. She was thinking. And that small shift in her behavior made me realize just how much had been left unsaid for so long. "I know," she said quietly, her gaze downcast. "I've been so scared. Scared of everything. And I never knew how to talk about it. About how I've been pretending." I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself steady. "I need you to stop pretending, Sarah. I need you to be real with me. I need to know who you really are. I can't keep living in this bubble where everything is okay when it's not." She nodded, her hands still trembling in her lap. "I'll try," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I'll try." I looked at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes. For the first time in years, I felt like I was seeing the real Sarah, the person behind the mask she'd been wearing all this time. And as painful as it was, I knew that this was the beginning of something important, something we had both been avoiding for far too long. But even as I tried to come to terms with the idea of rebuilding from this place of raw honesty, there was a part of me that knew it wasn't going to be easy. We couldn't just sweep everything under the rug and move on. There were too many unresolved issues, too much unspoken pain. But maybe, just maybe, we could start fresh. Maybe we could begin to untangle the mess we had made of each other's lives. I stood up, pushing my chair back and walking over to where Sarah was sitting. I knelt down in front of her, looking her in the eyes. "We can't fix everything overnight, but we have to start somewhere." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears, but also a glimmer of something else. Hope, maybe, or the realization that we were finally speaking the truth. "I know," she whispered. "I know." I reached out and took her hands in mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were both in this together. But the road ahead would be long and uncertain. There were no guarantees. But as we sat there, holding each other's gaze, I realized something important. The ultimate battle wasn't just about fixing the relationship. It was about understanding each other, truly seeing each other for who we were, flaws and all. And that, I hoped, would be enough to build something new, something real. The night after the conversation with Sarah was a strange one. I thought that, in some way, talking things through with her would provide a sense of closure, but instead, it left me feeling more uncertain than ever. We had both said things, truths, accusations, and confessions, but nothing felt resolved. The tension between us wasn't just in the words we exchanged, but in the heavy silence that lingered long after the conversation ended. There was no instant understanding or comfort in knowing we had aired our grievances. In fact, I began to realize just how much we hadn't truly understood about each other for the last 6 years. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. The quiet of the house pressed down on me, and I felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past couple of days. The call-off of the wedding, the accusations of infidelity, the revelation that my brother, Carl, had been engaging in behavior that was now entangled with my own mess. Everything felt like it was crashing down all at once. I wanted to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, my mind would race with thoughts of what had been said, what I needed to do next, and how on earth I was going to find a way out of this tangled mess I had found myself in. I tried to push it all aside and focus on something, anything else. But the more I thought, the clearer it became. I couldn't ignore what was happening with Carl. The situation with him had been brewing for a while, and I knew it had reached a breaking point. He and I had always been close, but this was something entirely different. Carl had always been the older brother, the one I looked up to. He was my role model growing up, responsible, wise, and steady, the kind of guy who had his life together. And while I had always admired him, I never once thought that he would become involved in something like this. He had a family. He had a wife, Karen, and 2 kids. He had a reputation, one that he had spent years carefully crafting. Yet here he was, having used my computer to sex strangers. It was a betrayal, not just to me, but to his family. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I could feel the betrayal settling in, a gnawing sense of discomfort, almost like an infection spreading through my thoughts. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the one who needed to be angry. Maybe Carl did. Maybe he was the one trapped in a situation that was spiraling out of control. That thought stuck with me as I tried to sleep, and by morning, I knew I had to do something about it. I couldn't sit idly by. I needed to confront Carl, needed to understand why he had made the choices he did, and ultimately how much of it was really his fault. But I also had to figure out if there was any way I could fix the damage that had already been done. If I had to shoulder the blame for the mess with Sarah, so be it, but I couldn't let my brother's actions go unchecked. There had to be a line drawn somewhere. I decided to wait until later in the morning, giving myself some time to process. When I eventually logged into Facebook and dialed Carl, I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an apology, maybe a half-hearted excuse, but I needed the truth. I needed him to tell me exactly what had been going on. It didn't take long before he answered. I could hear the rustling of papers or some kind of noise in the background, indicating that he was in his office. "Hey, what's up?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of something that sounded a little too cautious. Like he knew something was coming, but he didn't know what. "Hey, Carl," I said, leaning back in my chair, trying to steady my breath. "We need to talk. About what happened at my place." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could almost hear his brain whirring as he tried to figure out how to respond. Finally, he sighed deeply. "Look, I know why you're calling. And I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in that position." I rubbed my forehead, trying to keep the frustration from creeping into my tone. "Yeah, you really shouldn't have. Do you have any idea what this has done to my life, Carl?" Sarah thought it was me. She thought I was the one doing it. Carl was quiet for a moment, but I could hear him moving around in his office, his chair creaking as if he were leaning forward, preparing to speak.
I didn't know, man.
I really didn't know. I didn't mean for it to get like this. I was just frustrated. You know how things have been with Karen. It's been bad, man. Really bad. I closed my eyes. Of course, I knew things had been bad between Carl and Karen, but I had no idea it had reached this point. I had been so wrapped up in my own problems, my own mess with Sarah, that I hadn't taken the time to check in on Carl. And now here we were. He continued, his voice growing quieter as he spoke. "Karen's been tired for years now. After the baby was born, things just stopped. I was doing everything I could, but it didn't matter. Nothing changed. It wasn't about love anymore. I just wanted to feel wanted, you know? And it's not like I was looking for anything serious. But when I started using your computer, it just got out of hand. It became this thing I didn't know how to stop." I was taken aback. I had always thought of Carl as the responsible one, the one who had everything together. And now I was hearing about his frustrations, his feelings of neglect, his desperation to be seen and desired. It made sense, in a way. Relationships can fall apart slowly, insidiously, until one person, like Carl, finds a way to fill the void with something they never expected to need. And it wasn't about the women. It was about the validation, the need for attention, for connection. He was trying to fill the emptiness that had taken root in his marriage. "But you can't just do that, Carl," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can't just ignore your marriage and run off to the internet for comfort. And you sure as hell can't use my computer to do it." Carl let out a long breath, and I could tell he was ashamed. I know. I'm sorry, man. And I swear, I'm not doing it anymore. Things have been better with Karen. We've been going to counseling for 6 months now, and it's actually helping. She's still tired, but at least we're talking. We're making progress."
I don't want to ruin that.
I wanted to believe him.
I really did.
But everything had changed. The trust between us had been broken. I wasn't sure if I could just move past it. "You need to tell Karen," I said firmly. "She deserves to know what's been going on."
It's not just about you, Carl.
"It's about her too. She needs the truth." Carl was silent for a few moments before he spoke again, his voice strained. "I know you're right. I will. I don't know how to do that without breaking everything. She doesn't deserve that." I could feel my heart heavy in my chest. This wasn't going to be easy for anyone. I had to make a decision too. Do I tell Sarah everything that had happened? Do I confess my part in all of this? Or do I just leave it, let Carl and his marriage sort it out on their own? It wasn't my place to play God in their relationship. But I couldn't just ignore what had happened either. The damage was done, and it was my responsibility to fix what I could. "I'll think about it, Carl. But you need to fix things with Karen. You've got to be honest with her." We hung up shortly after that, and I sat there for a long time, letting everything settle in. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a minefield, not knowing where the next step would take me. Later that night, Sarah came home. She didn't say much at first, just dropped her things in the hallway and went into the kitchen. The silence was oppressive, but neither of us wanted to break it. I wasn't sure what to say to her anymore. Words felt too big, too small, too inadequate. Finally, after a long stretch of uncomfortable quiet, she spoke. "So, what now?" Her voice was tired, but there was something else in it, a note of resignation, of waiting for some answer that neither of us had. I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't sure if I wanted to fix things. I wasn't sure if I could. But one thing was certain. We had to face the truth. All of it. And somehow, we had to rebuild from there. We spent the rest of the evening in silence, watching a movie together, though neither of us was really paying attention. It was more of a distraction, a way to avoid the uncomfortable reality hanging between us. Eventually, Sarah went to bed, and I stayed up a little longer, sitting in the dark. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. Tomorrow, I knew, we'd have to face it all again. But for tonight, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.